Hello. Welcome to Biblical Explorations with Pastor Paul. This is a series of deep dives into subjects on the Bible. We'll talk about different things, some of which you saw in the introduction, and go into them fairly deeply. The idea is to provide a study online for people during this COVID-19 time, and to also try to start a discussion. I'm asking that you put comments in the comment section on the video, or perhaps email them to me as well. I will put my email address, which is revzorn@optonline.net. That's REVZORN at OPTONLINE.net. I'll put that at the end of the video, and hopefully people will send in some questions and some comments, and we can discuss them in future episodes of this video. But for now, as I said, welcome to Biblical Explorations with Pastor Paul, and I hope you enjoy this first episode. Hello. Thank you for joining me for Biblical Explorations with Pastor Paul. Today's episode is the temple, central to Judaism, foundational to Christianity. We just came through Holy Week a few weeks ago, and during Holy Week, the temple figures prominently in Jesus' activities prior to his death and resurrection. On Palm Sunday, he enters the temple and cleanses it, and he teaches in the temple throughout the week. The chief priests and scribes, who were the ones that instituted his trial, were headquartered at the temple. So this is very, very central to what it means to be a Jew in first century Palestine. The temple, to understand it, you need to go way, way back. Back many, many years, even thousands of years, to a young baby who was born among Israelites that were threatened with all their children to be killed. That man's name was Moses. Now Moses was the leader of the Jews. He became God's spokesman. After being raised in the palace as a son of Pharaoh, he ended up killing an Egyptian who was abusing a Hebrew. And he fled into the desert, where he ran into his father-in-law Jethro, priest of Midian. He married, he had children, and then he came upon a burning bush. And God said, I want you to speak for me. I want you to go and free my people. Moses makes a bunch of excuses, but eventually he does go. And he goes to Pharaoh, and through the plagues and God's actions, the people are freed and leave Egypt, heading towards the Red Sea, where God wiped out Pharaoh's army, probably the most powerful army of the day. The people escaped through the sea, and they went to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. On that mountain, Moses went up into the fire and a cloud on top of the mountain to meet with God. The Bible says for 40 days. And God gave Moses the tablets of the 10 Commandments, a set of rules and laws for the people. So Moses became the leader of the people. He was the mouthpiece of God. He was a prophet, a great prophet. As we know later on in the Bible, the prophets spoke for God. God would tell the prophet something, the prophet would then go and tell the king and or the people, depending on which story we're talking about. Moses began to lead the people through the wilderness. About a year after receiving the 10 Commandments, God gave Moses instructions. He said, I want to dwell among my people. And so I need a place to dwell. And God gave Moses instructions, very, very detailed instructions, on something called the tabernacle. Here is a picture of the tabernacle. This is a drawing of the tabernacle set up in the wilderness. The nation of Israel is camped around the tabernacle itself. The cloud coming out of the tabernacle building itself represents the presence of God with the people. The people standing in the foreground are the priests who served in the tabernacle. This is an illustration of the tabernacle with its layout. On the far left, in the back, is the Holy of Holies, the place where the Ark of the Covenant, the chest where God was, sitting there. In front of the curtain that divided the Holy of Holies from the holy place is the altar of incense, where the priest would burn incense to make the prayers of the people more attractive to God, the table of showbread, and the great menorah, also called the golden lampstand. Outside the tent of the tabernacle in the outer court is the altar of burnt offerings, on which offerings of animals would be burnt, and then the laver, which is essentially a big pot of water where the priests could wash their hands. And finally, a photograph of the inside of the recreation of the tabernacle, a life-size recreation showing the showbread table, the great menorah, and the altar of incense with a man dressed as priest behind that. The curtains with the animals on them are the curtains that separate the Holy of Holies from the other place in the tabernacle. This model is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and can be seen. It's run by the Mennonites. As I said, the tabernacle is very detailed, the instructions that God gave Moses. Everything from the types of fabric. The people gave their gold jewelry and all of the gold that they had, and they fashioned the implements for the temple. The Ark of the Covenant, which held the tablets of the Ten Commandments, was built at this time and was housed in the very back of the temple. A space called the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, not yet the temple. And the only one who went in there was Moses, to speak to God, because that was the place where God was. We see in the tabernacle the features that will eventually be in the temple. First off, there is a courtyard around the temple proper. A fence that was fairly high, that went all the way around the temple and included a space well in front of it. The tent of meeting was near the back, but in front was a laver, which was a washing pot, an altar where the sacrifices would be slaughtered and sacrificed to God. When Moses would go into the tabernacle, entering the place where God was, the tabernacle would glow with God's presence. Moses' face glowed after being in with God. He would wear a veil over his face because it frightened the Israelites. The tabernacle stayed with the Israelites throughout their long time wandering through the desert during the Exodus. Scripture tells us they wandered in the desert for 40 years. Wherever they went, they would carry the tabernacle with them and set them up in the very center of the camp. And all of the Israelites would camp around the tabernacle. When God was in the tabernacle, pillar of fire at night, pillar of smoke during the day, to indicate the presence of God among God's people. When the people entered into Israel, crossing the Jordan River into the land that was to become Israel, Moses died before he went in. He had disobeyed God, and God said, well, you're not going to get to see the promised land, but go up on this mountain, I'll show it to you. God, good to his word as he always is, did just that. And then God buried Moses on top of that mountain, and Joshua took over. The Israelites, again, when they camped, they would set up the tabernacle to show that the presence of God was with them. Over time, they conquered the promised land. And one king rose among them, a little shepherd boy that God had picked as his choice to be king over Israel after a king that was very disappointing. And so God instructed the prophet to anoint this young boy, David, to be king over Israel. David then united the 12 tribes and took those 12 tribes into the land and set up Jerusalem as his capital. There was a mountain in Jerusalem, a mountain that tradition tells us is the place where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac to God. And David set the tabernacle up on that spot. As he was a king in a city, he set up a palace for himself using cedars from Lebanon. And the Bible describes for us exactly what was used and what this place was like. And David said to himself, and he said this to Samuel, I live in a house of cedar. It's not good that God lives in a tent. I think I should build a house for God. Samuel says, sounds good to me. Why don't you go ahead and do it? And then that night, God came to Samuel and said, no, I don't want David to build a house for me. Because David is a man of war. He has blood on his hands. Your son, David's son, will build a house for me. And that son was Solomon, King Solomon. The Bible goes into great detail on the building of that first temple that we've come to call Solomon's Temple. This picture of the temple shows what the temple is like. And you'll see a similarity between the temple and the tabernacle. This is Solomon's temple. While it's much, much fancier than the tabernacle, you can see that there are several things, several parts of the complex that are identical. For starters, there is a laver. This one is much larger. It's called a C, and it's held up by a number of bulls. Alternately, the altar is to the left, and on the opposite side, there are stairs that go up to the top of it because it's much longer. There are also stairs going up into the temple itself, and in the rear of the temple, the stairs go up even farther into the Holy of Holies. Here is a cutaway of that temple, and you can see inside that the basic elements of the tabernacle are carried over to the temple. You can see the curtain in the back that separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place, and the furnishings in the holy place. Here is a comparison of the interiors of both structures. On the left, Solomon's temple. On the right, the tabernacle. And again, you can see that all of the important areas are identical and have been copied over, or modified, I should say, from the tabernacle to the temple. More grandiose, more regal, but still having the same components and the same ideas. This temple became the center of Jewish life. Prayers happened there. People went there for festivals. It was understood by the Jews as the place on earth where God was. So the people would gather there at important times of the year to worship God and to praise Him. Now, when the tabernacle was first established, God also set up a priesthood to be the ones to carry out the duties of the temple, to lead the people in the worship of God. The original priest was Aaron, Moses' brother. And that duty has passed to members of that tribe of Levi. And that continued all the way through the temple. By the time of Solomon's temple, a hierarchy had developed. There were scribes and there were chief priests that would be in charge and lead the people in the worship of God, the sacrifices, and all of the other things. These all flowed from God's giving of the law back to Moses, way back at Mount Sinai. And you can read these in the first 5 books of the Bible. The structure at the temple ensured that the work of the temple could go on. And there were people who were dedicated to that full time. That indeed was their responsibility, their privilege, and even their career, as they continued to ensure that the people obeyed God's law and that the people continued to worship God in ways that were pleasing to God. As time went on, in large part because of corrupt leaders as kings and queens, the people moved away from God. They went off in their own way. They worshipped other gods. Now sometimes we'll look at that and we'll say, why does that get God so mad? People have done all kinds of horrible things. Yet God gets so upset with this one particular thing. Commandment number 1. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. In the Bible, we have a lot of language that's related to a marriage. God as the husband, the people as the bride of the husband. And so therefore, if the bride goes off after another husband, another god, it is equivalent to the people committing adultery. This is why God took that so very seriously. God would send his prophets to call the people back. Then the people would go astray again. And God would send a prophet to call the people back. And the people would go astray again. Prophet Elijah had to risk being killed by the king and the queen during his time. In fact, they did try to kill him. Yet he stayed true to God. But again, the people turned their backs on God yet again. And after many times, God rose up an army. And that army attacked Jerusalem. They burned the city and destroyed Solomon's temple. And the people carted off to bondage in Babylon. And the temple, Solomon's temple, was no more. The place where God was on earth no longer exists. And the people were carted off to a foreign land. And the lament is, how can I sing the songs of God in a foreign land? Because God's over there in Israel. We're over here. How can I go about doing that? And so the people were disconsolate, and in a lot of ways fatalistic in the land where they were. Yet God comes to them and says, plant vineyards, marry, have your children marry and take wives for themselves and have children, and prosper in the land where you are, because you will prosper if the land prospers. And so even during this very, very dark time for the people, God never once abandoned them. And so begins the Babylonian captivity. As the people were deported from Israel to Babylon and enslaved. But God was not done yet. And God, even in this seemingly darkest of times, would again come to his people to be their God, to take care of them, and to love and nurture them. Next time when we continue this study, we will look at how the people end up back in Israel. What were the events that happened, and what were the things that were central to the people? And how did that set the stage for Jesus' coming to the people? I hope you'll be able to join us for that. I hope you found this interesting. Again, I would ask you to leave comments in the comment section underneath the video, whether it be on Facebook or on YouTube. And I would ask that if that's not something you want to do, to either text me or email me. And that will add some fruit to our discussions. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I hope to see comments and questions from you as we go forward. Thank you again.